This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
In this monstrous episode, we discuss organic relationships, relaxed fun, and considerations for your play-by-post content. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Welcome back, everybody, to DM Shower Thoughts, the podcast where we discuss how to become our best selves through gaming. If you love our content, drop a 5-star review over on iTunes and check out our Patreon for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes audio, early access to episodes, and personalized DM coaching. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
We're going to kick things off with a thought from John that should probably lead into a whole bunch of other thoughts we've got.
It should. That's a lot of pressure. So one of the things that I've been noticing more and more, especially in games that I've been participating in that value meaningful, immersive gameplay, right? Which honestly, to me, doesn't have to be every D&D game. Like, there's been plenty of games I've played where it's literally everyone just wants to be a little silly. They bring kind of a joke character. We do a one-shot. We kill some stuff. We get some loot, and we end, you know? Not every game, I feel, to have fun needs to be, like, super meaningful and emotionally fulfilling and, like, really immersive to a complex, intricate world, right? Those are bonus things that if you have the right group can add a lot of satisfaction to your gameplay, but they're also advanced techniques and they're not appropriate for every group, right? But, you know, you hear this from a lot of D&D players where they create characters that have these very intricate or well fleshed out backstories. And I've been playing I've been playing in a lot of groups that are kind of more immersive and more meaningful. The players have a lot of investment with their characters. And it just kind of confirmed something that I think I said a lot of podcasts back, somewhere in the 20s or 30s in terms of episodes. So this is a while ago, which is a lot of times a character backstory is best felt through interacting with another player character. And what I mean by that is, you know, we've all played in games where player characters have some kind of secret, you know, where there's some kind of big revelation or some background motivation that kind of drives their decision making, you know. The classic one being, you know, my character is orphaned and they're very angry about that. So because of that, they're more willing to take risks, you know? So they don't have attachments. So it's easier for me to justify in my head why they would go plunge into dangerous dungeons and put their lives at risk. Because one thing that actually a fellow DM said to me is, like, if you think about what D&D combat is like, you know, for a real person, they're not just going to be like, oh, I took 60 hit points of damage. Now it's like, no, you got stabbed. Like, that's going to leave some psychological stuff that probably realistically wouldn't, like, it wouldn't resolve as cleanly as, oh, got a magic sword, off to the next dungeon. Like, so so a lot of times, you know, players that come up, and we've been talking about, you know, with Adam's latest Gray Owl session and that kind of stuff, you know, how to develop characters that feel like they live in a world, characters that have, you know, meaningful backstories and how that plays in. But, you know, I've been running a few games myself lately, and one of the things that I noticed is that players developed organic relationships when they were very interested in each other. And when other players would be open to answering those things. It doesn't mean that when a player says, oh, what's your thing? You have to be like, well, here's my 10-page backstory and let me read, you know? And it doesn't mean you have to give away every secret. But one of the things that I notice is that a lot of times the characters that seemed less engaging to both my players and me as a DM are the ones where it's like, oh, so hey, where do you come from? You wouldn't understand. And then they just, like, look out a window. And that's all you get, you know? There's no connection, you know? Whereas if it's the opposite, where let's say, this is my player character, I'm the DM. You know, PC asks this player, like, oh, you know, how did you learn magic? And they're like, you wouldn't understand. But then I have an NPC as a play, like as a DM, and I get into a one-on-one conversation with them. And then that one-on-one conversation leads to that player leaking a backstory secret. It's also less satisfying because it's establishing a connection between the player and the DM, not a player and a player. So a really good example of this that happened in my Geras game, which is one that I reference a lot, is you know, I had this scene where I noticed, based on the chat log, because I had the benefit of documentation, that in one of my latest sessions, Gowron, the sorcerer, was like really being kind of more than usually protective of another PC I had, which was a warlock, and not like in a weird way or a creepy way. It was just that they would notice, like, oh, you're upset. Is there anything I can get for you? You know, which I'm sure as a character they would do that anyway. But it just so happened that in this session, in this moment, my warlock had more of an emotional need than the rogue and the barbarian. So Gowron the sorcerer addressed that need, you know, and I was like, well, this is a really interesting dynamic that they've set up now. It's like, do you need anything? And then they put a blanket over them and they're like, thanks, you know, I appreciate it. That now is establishing an organic connection. Now, how as a DM can set up an environment that makes it so we can learn a little bit more about Gowron, you know, and we can learn a little bit more about Warlock, you know? So the idea being, oh, this is a unique pairing that we haven't seen before. You know, and a lot of times I've been listening to the Office Ladies podcast, which doesn't sound like a D&D thing, but a lot of times what they talk about is the writing process. And really, what is D&D? But one big like writing exercise and one big performative exercise. And the writers would talk about a lot of times when they were writing an episode, they would look at two characters that haven't really gotten a one-on-one interaction. And they would see what that interaction would look like to put them together. So in this particular session, you know, the warlock had like a drive to find obscure knowledge, right? They're like, you know, I need to learn more about this subject, but the mainstream libraries don't have anything on it because this is potentially dangerous knowledge. It's potentially forbidden knowledge. Gowron the sorcerer is like, I come from a library. I come from an academy that just so happens to have archives of forbidden magic, right? So not only do we get to learn more about the warlock character, because their drive is to find forbidden knowledge about where their warlock powers come from, we get to now learn about Gowron because we're going to go visit his origin story a little bit, you know? So to me, now as a DM, I'm not invested in Gowron's story and I'm not invested in the warlock story. I'm invested in the connection between the two of them, you know, and what that would look like and how that might strengthen the party's bonds, you know? So, you know, when we played out this scene, it was really fascinating because even though the front story, like Ian talks about, is finding the forbidden knowledge or whatever, what I got to do was I start to tease parts of like, oh, by the way, Gowron's magic is a little weird. Why might that be? And start to like let the warlock see where Gowron got Gowron's magic through her own discovery, you know? So now it's like, whoa, Gowron, I just discovered this artifact. And he's like, yeah, this is the artifact that gave me my weird magic. And now she's like, oh, well, what does that weird magic feel like? And now Gowron can open up a little bit more about specific details about how he views the world. And now, kind of like what Adam says, as players, not as characters, but as players watching this scene unfold, we now get to empathize with his character a little bit more. We now get to understand his motivations, how he looks at the world. And the characters care more about each other, you know? And I think that's, Adam's been talking about it with Grey Owl's book too, but this was like a specific technique that I just happened to recognize and wanted to share, which is a lot of times players are really excited about having secrets, but the only value of a secret is in its reveal, right? And the best way to reveal it is through another player actively discovering it, right? Rather than it being spilled out by circumstance, you know? One of the other things that I make sure to really include in my games, and I'm not sure if it's been recognized so much by my players as an intentional structural design decision, not a storytelling decision, is pretty much most of the games that I run in Gearus have what's called a train scene, where basically everyone sits on the train and gets to talk to each other. You know, the purpose of this is to give players the opportunity to create their own organic connections by being interested in each other, you know? And the idea being that a lot of times characters haven't adventured with each other. They're meeting each other for the first time, and the company has just decided to hire these random adventurers because their abilities will work well together given what the mission is, but they don't know each other personally. From a metagame perspective, that company is me. I'm looking at which players will have interesting interactions, which player characters are going to form organic connections. What will that ultimately look like, you know? And so the purpose of these train scenes is also really just to demonstrate the most important aspect of having an immersive scene like this is patience. I'm not driving the story forward. I'm not asking the players what they would like to do. I just say, players, do what you talk to each other however you want. When you're ready to move on, just tell me you're ready to move on. And oftentimes these train scenes, like in a 5-hour session, they take about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And that's before the quest is introduced, right? And the rest of it is pretty boilerplate procedural. It's talk to the quest giver, figure out the quest, go to the quest, fight the thing, figure out the denouement. You know, that part is actually the easy part, right? Because that's the part I planned out. I can't plan out organic interactions, but I can practice a disciplined process of figuring out what's going to encourage those interactions. And I find that setting up an environment that makes it easy for player characters to inquire other player characters about their backstories is the most immersive way to do that. So yeah, now I'm going to open up the floor. Share me your thoughts.
I find a lot of value in allowing the players and characters to kind of figure each other out. There's been one of my apprentices has now started up Curse of Strahd. And Curse of Strahd is a Gothic horror setting, and this apprentice is really good at Gothic horror. They're really good at setting up the world, and they've already demonstrated they've been practicing atmosphere and immersion, and they're really good at kind of setting all that up. And we had a very successful session 0. Sometimes they'll pull me for resources, but they really want to do a lot of it themselves. And we're bringing in 2 players that haven't normally played with us, and then more veteran players. And really good session 0 of bringing in backstories and having a nice open discussion, and then also opening the door if you want secrets to hold on to those. If you want them revealed, that the DM will do their best to not reveal them, and whisper function and whatnot. And I find it very interesting on the subject of building connections with PCs and then building connections with players, and how this tends to change with from the beginning of a campaign and as a campaign progresses. And when I talk about beginnings, I mean session 1, the first session with a group of people, because the players are playing for the first time together and the characters are playing for the first time together, even if there's a pre-established history of people. Like my character knows and is well known in the town, so the other people that live in the town know of her, and then I'm friends with one of the other player characters, and there's already an established relationship there. But then if we have new people that come in, how those interact is really interesting. What we discovered with this session in particular that I found so intriguing is that the energy is different. And the energy can change whenever you swap out one person. We have had 4 players. We took 3 of those from a previous game and then added 2 new people for this game. And just that jumbling changed the energy at the table to very silly jokes happening in the chat log. Like really, really off the wall in this Gothic horror setting, like very silly and very funny. But then the interactions between the characters were really interesting and organic and very funny. And this was a really interesting way to see new players and veteran players who have not played together before. In a way, whenever you mix up the party, I think that because we're not sure of each other yet, that everybody they can either get really, really down, like really quiet and watch a lot more, or they just bounce off the walls a lot more and see what sticks. And it seemed like this was the latter. We had a lot more crazier interactions, a lot more off the wall things, a lot more like, hey, so what are you all about? And trying really hard to understand each other and get their names, because we all just got lumped together, joined, volunteered for a job, and now we want to know, who are we working with? Who are these people? And in so doing that, these new player mixes, we very quickly established who in the group feels like the young one that we want to protect, and who in the group is the one we're like, oh, we don't have to worry about you. Who in the group is just kind of there for comedy at the moment, or we can't really trust what they're saying, but they're a delight anyway. Who's going to be annoying, and who's actually like the emotional rock, at least for now. And it was so interesting to see everybody kind of shift into those roles in a very quick succession and still all be open to kind of taking our characters and just clashing and figuring out what's what. And in that explorative way, it's really helpful to see we established our dark Gothic backstories. And then when we played session 1, that darkness hasn't come to fruition yet. So it's all that surface level, first time you ever meet somebody at a party type feel. And I find it really interesting that you can have silliness and still have a Gothic horror setting. It was just a very cool view of the beginnings of a new campaign, and how that first session, that energy is going to change as we start to explore each other's backstories and more things are going to be revealed. But already all of these relationships are connected, and it was just because the DM allowed space for it to happen.
Yeah. One quick thing I want to say just before I pass it over to Ian is one of the things that's become clearer and clearer, especially I guess over the past week or two, is that when something looks or feels organic, usually it's the result of disciplined experience. That it's not just, oh, it happened and it was magical. The idea was that at some point there was disciplined effort and just raw experience. Because sometimes, I think like Ian is like the perfect example of this. He knew all the stuff. Like he knew like what soft skills and peripheral techniques to use when he started DMing. But like he just needed experience, so like he needed the players to be like, this well is suspicious, to be like, oh well, now I need to adjust this little thing. And but now that he also has the experience, and that like there's the that it's been disciplined from the beginning, it's just now that there's the experience and the discipline together. When Ian runs a game, like even Frostmaiden Saga was like really organic, flowing development. But that flow isn't a lack of discipline, which I think a lot of players think. And they think they get the idea it just kind of happens. It's the fact that you're looking up the rules, that you're understanding how features work. You know how the rules as written work. And because of that, you know how to bend them a little bit. And I think, Adam, what you're speaking to a lot is with new players, they don't have discipline or experience yet. So even if you want to run a cool Gothic horror game like Curse of Strahd, they haven't committed to the darkness because they're not quite sure how. You know, it's not a bad, it's just that they're new. It's kind of like if you have a new driver, they still have to go through the checklist. You've used that metaphor before, where if you have a new driver, they can't just drive. They have to first, you know, set up their mirrors. They have to figure out how the Prindle works, you know. They have to like get themselves in the right seat and everything. Whereas somebody who's a little more experienced can just drive, and that's it. It looks easy, but it's because the hard work has already been put in, you know. Anyway, now that I just praised him, I'm gonna kick it back to Ian.
Thanks. So with this situation, it's very interesting because I've tried to run Curse of Strahd twice now. The second time it's still ongoing, so it's going pretty well. But the first time I felt like a little downtrodden. I didn't feel like I had done it very well. Even though John, like John was saying, I had some really great, ideas about techniques and methods and how I was going to present this. The lack of experience was kind of killing me. It kind of suffocated the campaign, in my eyes, because I was overwhelmed, simply put. First of all, 6 players. Second of all, 6 players online. Third of all, transitioning from in-person to online. It's like a lot of these things, because it was fundamental in how I developed my DMing technique, for the future, but that didn't make it like easier or whatever. And ultimately I had to scrap the campaign. I was like, well, hopefully we'll come back to this, but I feel like I'm not doing it justice, and I don't feel like I'm doing right by you guys, my players, in terms of what you were looking to get out of this, even though we all said, we know you're a new DM, we know to be forgiving and stuff. There, personally, I felt uncomfortable with where the campaign was going, because I didn't know how to proceed, simply enough. And I didn't want to just throw it out there and hope that it stuck or whatever. I wanted to do it right. And so I put it away for a while, and I didn't pick it up until like a while later. And that was after I had used the prequel model for Curse of Strahd that I had come up with, which was basically taking a few characters from Curse of Strahd and putting them into almost a whole new storytelling thing. I think it's interesting that you're talking about the energy of this particular session, Adam, and saying how it didn't feel like Gothic horror or something. But that reminded me that the energy can change in other sessions and later sessions, and you can like really get into the Gothic horror. But it reminded me that of this element that I had learned about presenting horror in a D&D setting, which is that you can't have horror without some sort of light. There needs to be contrast to compare to. Otherwise, it's just normal. It's like how we talked about in episode 113, that people living on a volcano will normalize that life until something really bad happens and the volcano explodes. So you can't just perpetually keep your players in darkness. You can't just perpetually keep your players in horrific scenarios, because otherwise it just gets boring. And it also reminded me that Gothic horror, like, I don't think I even have like a great definition for Gothic horror. I think it's kind of some term that I've been throwing around for a while. However, I do think that it might, if I look at Bram Stoker's Dracula was Gothic horror. It would be considered essentially the prime example of Gothic horror. And it was pretty gloomy. Like, there wasn't any light to it. I think it was the first time that, like, not the first time, but like a good example of when horror was really developing as a storytelling format that was written, that people could buy a book and read and stuff like that. And so they were really, exploring new avenues, so to speak. But if we look at how horror has developed now, there are so many more techniques that we've discovered, even though we consider these books classic or, prime examples of what we should model our horror on. And there are definitely a lot of elements and stuff. I think the way you described this, with these interactions between these characters, is a good setup for Curse of Strahd, because it sets the tone for the party, even if it doesn't set the tone for the setting. And then when the setting contrasts what the party members might be expecting to go into, like with, for example, in my campaign with Coco being like the most innocent of our party members, so to speak, I say, they feel that power, the power of the Gothic horror, the power of dread, basically, that is suffused into the campaign.
I'm glad that we bring up the concept of levity, and I think about levity in contrast to horror elements and that Gothic element. Our levity was experienced in the tavern. We're all getting to know each other. Once we got to Barovia, like we passed a skeletal horse, and that like set the tone. We were like, oh, there's a skeleton rider just walking past in Barovia. What? Well, that's new. We tried to interact with it. That sort of set the stage of what sort of things are we going to be working with. And as a group, now that we sort of established, okay, this is your name, this is kind of your basic baseline deal, that allowed that experience to happen, us as players to go, whoa, and then us as characters to turn and go, well, he wasn't very helpful, now was he? Oh, well, and laugh about it a little bit and then continue forward. That's not us making fun of the campaign or trying to, change the tone. It's us reacting in character that in a lot of ways, instead of living in that tension, trying to break the tension a bit. But we had like high levity until we got to Barovia and things got a little bit rougher. And that is huge. When I say that I think the tone is going to vacillate and change, it's that levity levels are going to adjust as you start to experience more things. And that levity, that established levity, is going to help reinforce against the darkness. That what we see here is when we make jokes in character, especially not just as players, but in character, when we're like, we combat the darkness by making fun of it or combat the darkness. It's a defense mechanism. It's a way to reinforce ourselves and steel ourselves against the evils we're going to see. And if we've even brought it up before we started recording, that the mental fortification of an adventurer is probably better than the average person. That you can see some crazy things and still kind of step through them. And isn't it cool to then try to explore why are they able to do that? And I think in like personally, my character's reason is because she sees death all the time. And it's just normal for her. Not in a tragic way, just in a, oh, okay. Because spirits literally talk to her. And it's kind of annoying. So for her, it would make sense for her to look at that skeletal horse and treat him like a person, basically, because it's just this is another Tuesday for her. But then others might say, oh, well, this is just an illusion, or this is a trick of the mind. This is, or maybe they're religious and they go, that's a fallen spirit, and they can justify it in different ways. Whereas maybe the average person would go, oh God, oh God, oh God, what did I see? Whereas an adventurer may have a more complex understanding of what might be happening there. And I like that understanding can be well informed by their backstory, whether that backstory is things that are going to be reincorporated later, or they are established norms and expectations of who they are right now that would then inform how do they react to what they just saw. And I think those reactions also, not even just like a secret being revealed, but they tell the other players and the other characters that you're with, what are you about? How do you react to these things? And this was a great example of players that, even if they're new to the mechanics of the game, they're not new to role play. That's probably an important distinction, because they all reacted in different ways that spoke volumes about where they came from and who they are as people. I just found that very fascinating in that shift. And then we all had our own coping mechanisms to deal with what we just saw. Some of that's levity, and some of it is, I just don't talk about it, and we keep going.
Yeah. I think think that's a good point, is that just because you as a party have started with this levity and stuff like that doesn't mean that when you see something horrific or whatever that you're all gonna still trend towards that levity. You might. I'm just saying that, like, there's something there's something about the way players choose to roleplay their characters' coping mechanisms that really can speak to what kind of person they are. Yeah. And that kind of brings me back to what we were talking about at the start here with John's comment on character interactions and how that brings out backstory like the best. And it reminded me, you were talking about the train scene, John, and it reminded me of how in other video games that I've played that have deep storytelling elements, deep narratives to explore with characters who are like fully fleshed out and not just 2D tropes or something, or one-dimensional tropes. There is usually a moment when nothing's going on that the player character, you, can talk to these characters and learn more about them. In Skyrim, it's like, it's a little bit different because you get multiple options to ask them, and usually you can just kind of choose each one and go through them and learn more and more and more. Whereas maybe if you're talking to a fully fleshed out character, what you've done in the past will open up certain dialogue options or keep other ones secret, and that makes them more compelling characters, in my opinion. So with, and Skyrim almost does this with Serana. Serana has a lot of things she can tell you about in her about her origin stories and stuff, but at the same time, it's not all of it usually. I think there's a couple of choices, but not all of it is usually based on your actions. It's based on your actions, but it's not based on critical decisions you've made, as opposed to just slowly unlocking those dialogue options over time. Like, I don't remember which, but I think there's like only one or two dialogue options that are locked away forever if you make a certain decision. And that makes it so that you are more compelled to upload a different save. You reload your save so you can get that decision made properly. In other games, for example, Undertale, there are like Easter egg dialogue options that you have to unlock based on decisions you made, depending on what path you're taking: neutral, true pacifist, or genocide. And then there's another game that I've seen played that involves it's a romantic game basically, and there's a lot of social interaction, even, and I would say that it's almost prioritized over the gameplay, which is puzzle solving. And it's very interesting because there's a bar scene basically every single day, and at that bar scene you can talk to the different characters and learn more about them, and depending on the choices you make, you will get a different ending at of the game. And there's like 200 different endings or something, with like main categories of ending. Like, there's no like good ending, it's just ending based on choice point A, B, and C. And so I think it speaks very well to that technique of using a moment every session where player characters can talk to each other to learn more about each other, when you see it in other media like those video games, because those video games are successful. So that's probably something that's contributing to it.
So you said something, Ian, that I'd like to actually contest just a little bit, which is, you had mentioned with this game that a lot of times the social interaction is prioritized over the gameplay, which, if I were to put this into D&D terms, I would say that interaction is the gameplay. So a lot of times for this so-called train scene that I make sure to include, even if it's not literally on a train, I call it like a train scene. There's usually some kind of scene that at the beginning part of whatever session I'm running that gives players however much time they need to immerse themselves in the world, right? And as a DM, a lot of times I'm just quiet for most of it. Like, it's really not about moving them forward ever. It's about giving them however much time they need to immerse, right? So, and you can't force immersion. Immersion is a permission-based thing, right? The character has to basically give you permission to immerse. So if you find that a character is not engaging a whole lot, it might just be that they have not given permission to immerse. There's nothing you can do about it other than create a comfortable setting that gives them, that incentivizes them to want to immerse, and again, comfort is the key thing here, right? So like when it comes to this PC to PC interaction, you can lay down a little topic of discussion. So for example, a lot of times, like for this game, the latest game I played that had kind of an intricate hour-and-a-half long train scene, it started with, that everyone is gathered because you're going in a job to Karshan, and you know that there's some monster you have to take care of. Go. That's all I'm going to give you. Now, if the players are all like, oh, no, we're fine, we just want to move on to the quest, we're good, then I'll say, all right, the train arrives at the station, you head off to wherever to learn the quest. Most of the times, players don't want to do that. They want to sit around and they want to be like, so, heard about this monster job? No, I haven't. Interesting axe there. How do you plan on killing the monster with it? Well, you see, this axe was passed down from my father. Characters love talking to each other like that, and that organic is development, but also it's comfortable because it's also a result of, again, the disciplined experience that I've invested in the past 5 years of gaming, of forming clear communication channels, and also like investing trust in my players, So, and one of the things that I've been told is that, there's a player that a lot of times has a hard time immersing into character. And they told me that this character, no matter how much time is in between sessions, they can always slip right back into character really easily because they can relax into the environment and the immersion. They never feel like they have to contribute, and they never feel like there's something they have to get done or something they get pushed into doing, right? As a DM, I make sure to never ask, what do you guys want to do next, unless it's like really obvious that the characters want to do the next thing, So that way they can just take their time interacting, and basically the players get to determine the momentum of the session based on where they are that night. There's been sometimes I've had train scenes that are like half an hour. There's been sometimes I've had train scenes that are almost the whole session, but really, to me, that train scene is where the players get to breathe. And even if it takes, if I'm not getting immediate responses, to me, it's an indicator that my players are composing thoughtful responses. And what's more immersive and meaningful than that? So like a lot of times, like for me, that's where players play, and that's where their most meaningful play comes from, is the social interaction. And it's also what can make some choices kind of tough, is because they care,
This ties really well into everything we've done so far, and from our previous podcasts. We've mentioned before, like how we can break the paradigm of what authentic D&D is, and I'm going to circle back to that in just a moment. But this also represents a distinct paradigm shift. It's interesting how, enhanced dialogue and inviting your players to have dialogue with each other adds immersion and value to your game. Who'da thunk it? As these are individual, variable human beings and not computer programs, the dialogue trees, in a way, can never be exhausted. Though they might have dead ends in a way, like you insulted someone or you struck a nerve. So, I'd say my character is actually uncomfortable now, and they're not going to interact with you, at least for now. But also, that can be solved in a creative way. If that other character made a character uncomfortable, they could also seek to rectify that. Whereas a computer program might be like, they're just mad at you now, and they're not going to talk to you. And there's a deeper variable there. And all of that in reading some posts, more posts, throwing the the Facebook groups under the bus a little bit. I'll read complaints from DMs going, my players never want to engage in the plot. They just want to talk to each other in character. To which I say, good. They want to talk to each other in character. That's what's valuable to them. They're going to build all these cool, strong relationships with each other. And man, that must be nice, just to actually enjoy hanging out. And isn't it great? And even when I listen to some of the live play shows, or actual play shows, that you'll go through like a plot arc, and then it's so great when the characters get to take a breath, return home to a city, and then go on a pub crawl and just enjoy interacting with each other. That's it. That's still play. And the thing that we brought up with that session 1 example is that even though it may not have felt as Gothic-y or as like intense toned role play, we're still playing, and we're enjoying playing at this table. We're understanding who we are and figuring things out, but we're having a really good time, and that's the goal. So, and if we've got to always check in, was the DM having a good time? Yes. Were the players having good times? Yes. Were we establishing relationships? Yes. Did we move forward in the basic plot of the arc and the system? Yes. We don't have to have a certain checkpoint if we don't want to, if all those other conditions are met. And what we have to start doing is have that little paradigm shift that the plot, we'll sometimes joke about, I follow the plot. And in my mind, everything we do in character is the plot. If the train scene takes 2 hours and we're talking with each other, that's still the plot. The plot doesn't have to be quest, monster, destroy, that's it. What if it's all the plot? And the plot has different story beats and possible encounters, and it can have a battle, it can have violence, and that's a part of the plot. It's all the plot. And in hearing from a few people, they will complain about their players. They just don't. They take forever to get to the plot. To which I wonder, what are they here for? What energizes them? And if what energizes them is just playing together, and that play is their interactions, maybe you're actually achieving your goal. And maybe as a DM, you've provided a safe, trusting space where they feel like they can interact in that way. And that should be celebrated. But then there is still something to say about how do I pull them into the story, like this greater story, the conflicts, the other things I've planned for them, without feeling like I'm forcing them away from these other valuable interactions. And that's, I think, a deeper conversation. It isn't that they're defying you in the sense of your plot is dumb and I want to do this instead. It might be something, there might be a deeper conversation there.
Now that you've said it like that, it's made me want to open up the conversation a little bit. Not that we can't come back to this topic, but so here's the thing about a train scene is that it's literally a railroad. I know that you just talked about the value of the fact that your players interacting is the plot. The other reason, and I've talked about this with a few different players, is that the players feel comfortable taking their time to interact with each other, is that they're confident they're also going to get stuff done at the end of the session. That it's not, am I meandering and are we just talking about random crap? They know that I've prepped a very specific series of events that is going to advance the story and give them the satisfaction that they've checked things off of a list. That there's, because again, it all stems from there's a monster to go kill, and it's one of the things, honestly, I asked my players, or I asked of my players before even playing with them, is that, listen, each session I'm going to bring a new quest. I'm going to bring some kind of objective. We're not going to dilly-dally talking about your character's motivations for, well, would my character want to go kill a monster or go investigate this? No, if you are going to have a problem with motivation, figure that out before you show up to the table. Don't waste my time and everybody else's time to fit your needs because you want to be antagonistic as a player, you know? So it's actually, I would say it's not only trust in the fact that they have space to interact and organically connect with each other, it's also trust that they know that they're going to hit all three pillars of play throughout the session, you know? That and I said it in this last session too. I would pause and I would, for a break, and I would say this is measured out to a science, you know? And it was because every single pillar of play was hit in almost an exactly measured way. And there was a lot of DMs honestly would look at the model that I'm using and say, you're railroading your players, you're limiting their choices. Not one player has complained to me that they felt like their choices have been limited and that they feel railroaded or their choices don't matter. And it's because the railroaded session is based off of the choices they've expressed to me of where they want to see their characters go.
Remember that structure is not a detriment. A structure to your session is not a bad thing. I have seen people throw around like, oh, I support unstructured play. And it's like, so your session, your 3 hours, if you only have 3 hours to play, could only be you joking around for an hour. And then you are in the game world for an hour. And then it's a full sandbox, complete sandbox where you could mess around for 4 hours straight, but not actually get anything done when you look at it from a place of what happened from A to B. Oh, we walked and we talked to this one guy. Now, we understand the value of scenes. And what I really want to try to tie this back to is when we talk about the tools and recommendations to try to provide the best experience at the table, I highly recommend formatting your sessions in scenes. Those scenes can be, scene by scene, can explode and be very out there and sandbox-y, but there's a point where, like reading a story, where we skip ahead in the action. You don't have to painstakingly go through, now I walk down the hallway, now we go talk to this guy. It can just be, we finish our conversation, okay, I'm ready to move on. You're in the office of the guy, here's the next scene. And that's all right. And I actually think that that's highly rewarding because we are playing a game. And this is a way to utilize the game state in a way to your benefit. Make the game work for you. And we know that having a structure adds tremendous value to your gameplay sessions. Now, the structure could just be, they're in a dungeon, and I have planned for them these 3 rooms. This middle room has a wizard in it that they can talk to. Or they'll murk him, and that's the scene. And there'll be other aftermath there, but there's a possibility they can talk to them. I highly recommend whatever structure you have, that you have a scene planned, dedicated to, not forced, but dedicated to open the space for the players to interact with each other. The characters can check in with each other, or they can have that moment to breathe. And if you don't have that you let them know, guys, this might be an intense number of scenes and you're at like a time limit, so like a time crunch, there may not be time for you to like check in with each other. Just letting you know. And sometimes removing that can add extra intensity to that session, but then bringing it back is another thing. It's communicating what those expectations are. But I highly recommend that you have a time that you can have that check-in. And I guess now that I've said it out loud, even if I have an intense session where I know, like, guys, you're in the middle of a fight, there's a time limit, we got to go. If I have live play, sometimes I'll actually have, and the players have said they like this, but I'll take out a little timer and flip it. And they got to kind of figure out what to do in real time. But But those moments are rare, and they aren't always the norm. They're kind of like a novelty that you would bring out. Even in those intense sessions, I might have a limited amount of time that you can have this scene, or a limited number of conversations. Because also we assume that the characters don't blue screen. So if the player is formulating a response, the character isn't sitting there going, oh, and frozen in time, going AFK, you know? But we've learned there's an immense value in allowing for dialogue between characters, and there's immense value in having a scene structure. It also lets the players know how much you have for them. That's actually extremely valuable. I find that to be very relaxing. If I know, okay, we've done these 3 scenes, where there's one more scene, I'm getting kind of tired. I think I've got one more scene in me. Even if I don't have to know about what the scene's about, I don't have to know the secrets of everything, but knowing we have one more scene planned tonight, everybody, and then we'll jump into that. Structure isn't bad, is the end result of all of that. That's another paradigm shift. People will bring up structured play as a negative. I think structured play is a positive, but it needs to be planned appropriately.
Yeah, so I came to this realization just now, sort of. I know we've talked about using the blank canvas and how intimidating that can be, how much choice paralysis you can have when presented with a blank canvas. And that's kind of reflected in the sandbox model of D&D. D&D can be a sandbox, but when you treat it like it's a true sandbox, then it can be really intimidating, and I think it can really easily fall on its face. As John has expressed before, sandboxes require immense amounts of prep. It's literally like creating a whole... It's like the amount of prep that it would take to create Skyrim, right? Skyrim's not a sandbox because technically your dialogue options are limited, and you're generally encouraged to kill everything. But it's such a broad world that you feel like you can do anything. You feel like you can go anywhere, do anything, talk to anyone, unless they're hostile to you from the get-go because they're bandits. And it's that sensation of that's what open worlds convey. Is they convey the sensation of a sandbox without it being a sandbox. I would say Minecraft is a sandbox game. That is like a true sandbox game because you can literally choose to do anything and you're the only player in it. And there's no NPCs to talk to. Like, you have the villagers or whatever, but really that's just another resource for you to build with. So Minecraft works that way, but these immersive storytelling games are harder to turn into a sandbox. And so that's why I'm thinking that that's why I'm drawing the conclusion here that D&D, it's great when D&D feels like a sandbox. It's great when it feels like you have all the agency in the world and you can do whatever. But if it's a true sandbox, that's where it can kind of fall a little flat. And so it's good to say that we're not limiting our players' choices by saying that we're not railroading them, right? We're not limiting our players' choices by saying these are the 3 options that you have based on the information presented. We are providing those options, allowing them to choose based on who their characters are, what they prioritize, and what's been going on just recently that may be affecting their decisions. And that's another thing is that I just wrote this down. I've been thinking about this for a couple of weeks, but I forgot until just now that social interaction works to pre-frame our actionable choices. Whatever social interaction we have before we get on with the quest, quote unquote, is going to flavor how that quest feels, how the combat feels, and how the conflict is resolved. So, for example, in one of the Geras games, our quest was to go and investigate the disappearance of a whole bunch of people, and it turned out that a beholder had turned them into statues or something like that. And it's been a little while since we played that one, so I might be quoting it wrong, but more or less that's what I remember. And so before we got to that beholder fight, or before we found these statues and stuff, we got a chance to talk to people who had been around during the time at which those people had disappeared, or had witnessed the disappearance of these people. And these people had certain perspectives, biases, and prejudices that helped us to gain perspective on what was really going on around us. And that flavored how the boss fight went, because in the boss fight, we had to consider that there were other statues, living people, basically, around in the environment. It's like if you have a whole bunch of like chess pieces, basically, and you're the beholder, and these chess pieces are just made out of real people, and you just organize them and put them wherever you want because you think it looks pretty. And it's like, and then these adventurers come in and they start, wrecking everything up. The adventurers, we have to consider that these people might not be, completely gone. We have to consider we can't just hide behind them for cover all the time. Maybe sometimes, but I think we did that a couple times. But looking back on it, I think that might have been a mistake, because I'm pretty sure a couple of those statues got broken. So it's very, I don't remember, but if I'm incorrect, then yeah, John's shaking his head. So that's good. That's good to hear. But imagine the risk that we're taking, at least, by using those statues for cover. It puts a lot more pressure, and it spins the encounter in a different way that makes the world and the whole scenario feel more immersive. And so that's my point, is that what we talk about before the quest begins or before any conflict happens is going to preframe the actionable choices that we make. Basically, we're discussing the actions that we have, and then going and exploring or going and fighting is the result of those actions. And that's something I really like about D&D, is, that's a true expression. If you ask me, that's a true expression of player agency. And of course, tying it back to John's thought, it goes back into learning more about the characters through talking with each other and fighting with each other side by side, and seeing what we prioritize in a battle. And and if you guys are a party of like really efficient killers, that's great. Like you're just looking to end the fight as quickly as possible, that's awesome. But if you have a player that's a cleric and they've made an oath to do no harm, they're never going to cast inflict wounds. They're never going to do something that might cause another creature damage, in the statistical point of view. Looking back at Gray Owls and what you guys have said about a certain character, I don't remember which, but yeah.
Reblet Scoom. I pay attention. But anyway, so and actually, I'm glad I listened out both of you just now, because really, the meat of this is we're talking about structure, right? So like session structure, and there's a difference between a structure and what people tend to negatively view a railroad approach, where structure is how you set up the environment to focus your players' attention on certain things that they might care about or might not. Whereas the less structure you have, the less focused your game can be, So for example, if we say Curse of Strahd is Gothic Horror, that's a pretty specific focus, That's not just silly hanging out in Faerun wherever we go, like it's so, and to me, I would go so far as to say it's impossible to have immersion without focus. So the reason why I structure my games with an episodic approach is because it works with a player's neuroscience to give them the easiest way to immerse and remember. Because you also can't immerse if you can't remember what's going on in the world. So if we're spending half of our session just trying to figure out what's going on, how are you supposed to immerse? You have no focus or no anchorage, So the reason why I've always done my sessions, like the past 9 sessions of this new campaign I ran, with a beginning, middle, and end, is to close a distinct learning loop and it makes it easy for them to remember. So like I mentioned before, there's a player that says that in no other session have they ever felt like they can easily slip back into character. You know, they feel that no matter how much time is in between sessions, this character they can always slip back into. And it's because they can remember what's going on, because the session is designed, it's structured to be able to work with the way that people's neurology tends to work, right? So it's kind of like in education, they talk about chunking. So you have 10 to 20 minute chunks of information, and then you give the brain a time to rest, compact that information, and then organize it in relation to other information, you know? So we have a structured break every 90 minutes. And the reason for that is to close off a scene. And if there's like a little tail end of an interaction or something, then we do that, right? But if a session ends without the quest concluded, it makes it that much harder to re-immerse the next session, you know? So, and that's why even, and again, these aren't disconnected episodes, right? It's not like we're doing a monster of the week and then we'll see what adventure's up next week, and it also has no bearing on what's happened before or what's going to happen next. These sessions are all highly connected, and the conclusion of each session informs the beginning of the next session, right? But I really like how Adam put it, that especially when I prep a number of scenes, right? I don't prep a choice where my players get to choose which scene they're going to do next. Their choices are actually more meaningful that way, because now I'm not trying to give them an illusion of choice where they still get to the same outcome no matter what, right? They still end up at the same scene, which actually makes them trust the fact that when they enter a scene, it's been either thought out or they can mess with it, you know? So because there's no illusion of choice, there's true choice. And again, true choice is highly defined, right? So I love how Ian put it, which is the social interaction is going to lead to what the definitive choices are leading up into the next session, or leading into the later parts of the session, right? So one of the things that this works is it's literally built like a train, right? So you start with the first compartment, right? How you handle that first scene is going to affect the next scene, but you're still going to go on to the next scene no matter what, you know? If you guys decide one night, we're just not going to go to the quest giver, then I just say, okay, session's done, see you next week, and nobody gets to play. And really, is that a better choice than to just follow along and agree that maybe your characters are motivated to follow along? And to me, if you do the backstory work, if you do the right work ahead of time, it makes it easier for them to come on board. You know, it's kind of like if you're going to get on a train, it's a lot easier to board if you already have a ticket purchased, you know, and you gave yourself enough time that you're not rushing into the next thing. But it's also why Adam mentioned something that I thought was interesting, which is if you only have 3 hours to play, you might have to rush your players through certain scenes of intensity to get to the next thing. That's why I never set a time limit for any of my sessions, because I don't ever want to do that. You know, the priority one for the sessions I run is relaxed fun play. You know, it should never feel a have to, or it should never feel like you're making a decision under pressure and now you can never go back on it. You know, the second is meaningful, immersive gameplay, right? Meaning that I want things to matter. So you might have a tough choice. I might even let you go back on it, but when you make your decision, there will be something you give up and there will be something you get. That's what makes it a tough choice, not just the good choice, you know? So it's not a good option or a bad option. Both endings are good and bad at the same time. And then my last one is fair progression. I don't want any of my players ever feeling like there's a favorite. It's why I never award inspiration. I just give all my players one thing of inspiration at the start of a game. I always make sure everyone has equal gear options, so nobody's more or less effective based on me trying to pay attention to everything. I just give everyone the same options, and I allow for fair opportunity, but that doesn't always mean equal input, right? So if I say, would you like to contribute to something like this? Or what's your character doing? And they're like, nothing, then cool. I gave you a fair opportunity. You decided to not engage. Also, it means if they're not engaging, what about the environment is giving them resistance to engage? And sometimes it's a narrative thing. Sometimes it's a gameplay thing. Sometimes, again, it's a structural thing. It might be that a player is really uncomfortable with a sandbox approach, right? Where there's too many options, like Ian was kind of saying, right? So if I have infinite options, I don't know how to choose. There's nothing to go off of, If a player has, and to me, this is where the conflict I'm grappling with myself. If a character is highly motivated and they want to do stuff, why don't you have that conversation before and then design a session that allows them to do the stuff they're motivated to do in an episodic format, so that way you can conclude it, and so everyone remembers what happened, so that they're not fighting against their own neurology to try just because it's how it's always been done, So that's always like, I feel like I'm just reading our ongoing chat here. And one of the things about there was a comment about being highly motivated and proactive. When I have an episodic structure, it means I'm being proactive as the DM too. So I'm just not resolving it at the table. I'm resolving it beforehand so everyone can experience it at the table, And I think that a big part of online D&D that I don't think a lot of people are talking about, but is definitely part of the peripheral structure that makes these games work, is one-on-one communication channels using the digital technology we'll have access to, or else we wouldn't be playing online D&D. So things like Facebook messages, right? Just having a one-on-one channel where if a player is uncomfortable or they want to give me feedback, but worry about embarrassing me or themselves, they can open up that dialogue privately without needing to call either one of us out in kind of a forum format, So it's, to me, that the trust is built in the follow-up between sessions. You can even still have amazing story moments between sessions, but again, it's all part of that chat dialogue. So one last thing before I hand it off to whoever's going to go next. You guys will notice that in the Gearus short stories that are available on dmshowerthoughts.com, there are actually sections of those stories that didn't happen at the table. Those stories were actually post-by-play dialogue that happened one-on-one with players outside. The one I can point to that's actually up on the website, in Chapter 4, The Devil's Mercy, there was a point where basically the party had outvoted Gowron the Sorcerer, looping back to that, basically on a 3-1 vote about making a deal with the devil. And Gowron, it didn't sit right with them, right? Or sit right with him. So so at the end of the session afterwards, I had a one-on-one chat with that player. And we did a dialogue back and forth. And I just used that Facebook Messenger strand, and that's how I wrote up basically the end of that session. And it was like a 2 to 3 page write-up. None of the other players were there at the table to interject or make it about them or try to put their own spin on it. They weren't there, but they all still got to participate. It just wasn't in the moment participation. It was after the fact participation. That now if they want to, well, not that information in particular, because again, I wanted to make sure the players could participate without their characters participating, but they can still enjoy that moment without having their players having any knowledge of what happened in that one-on-one. So yeah, I'll kick it off to whoever's next.
When I talk about disciplined players and then the sandbox scenario, Gray's book 2 right now in the one group that's in it is very much a sandbox, but it's a sandbox with, I would call it at the moment, limited structure or even loose structure. And we've established this in previous podcasts that book 2, campaign 2 of Gray Owls, the characters have jobs. They have things that they do throughout the day. So in a way, those are kind of like the scenes that a certain amount of time will pass. And it's like, oh, you gotta go to your job, or a customer comes in, and that sort of interrupts the whatever they were maybe in the middle of doing, or, oh, I got to make sure I send my other clerk to go deal with that customer. And it kind of creates a timeline to how the day progresses. The adventures so far have taken place over the course of a day. So they start in the morning, move through their day, and then the day ends. The first 2 sessions were over the course of the same day because of intensity and whatnot, fight in the middle of all of that. But then we closed this wonderful loop. We ended on a cliffhanger the first time, and then we closed on this beautiful loop of someone looking over the tundra, thinking about their life, and it kind of closed in like a beautiful cinematic way. And we had a tag on the stinger at the end of the credits sequence, with that also cut to black of someone slamming into a wall. And it's a very funny little moment of this cool little character interaction. But those things that were created, the stories, were both organic, somewhat made up on the spot, and also not. And with Gray Owls, I ask for homework at the end of every session, which is, where are you mentally? What are your characters' initial thoughts? What are their goals? What do they want to accomplish today or in the future? Like short-term goals, long-term goals, and then have those changed. Like, where are you? Give me the lowdown. Because then I can craft appropriate moments where some of those goals can be acted on, or more information can be gleaned or gained for those goals. But when I say disciplined players, the Campaign 2 group right now has evolved from, okay, everybody, we wake up in the morning, this is your mission, here you go, and has evolved into consciousness comes to you all. Here's the descriptive text of what dawn has brought. The news reel comes through for everybody so they all hear the recap of the day and the strange businesses that are now having 10% off on their battle axes. And then they have their individual things that they want to accomplish. Sometimes those things they want to accomplish involve other characters. Sometimes they don't, at least at this point in time. And I'm trying really hard to take my time in allowing them to organically cross paths and organically work together and then split apart. There's a lot that can happen. And I know from the grand plan that there are many opportunities for them to cross paths and work together. But I'm not going to force them to do that in any way, shape, or form. I want to see them, and we knew this from session 0. I said, this might take a little while for you to become a quote unquote team. And that's okay. I want you to take the personal route and really dive deep into how you move toward your short-term and long-term goals. But I say all of that, and that's still a sandbox approach, but I've had them prep things beforehand, which has allowed me to prep things beforehand, so there are appropriate possibilities of scenes that can explore all those things. And I say that each ending to a session will have like a cinematic close that will move our way toward a closure of some sort of like loop, and it'll close like a story instead of, guys, it's late, we got to stop now. There's a framework of an act structure that can flow through this. And in so doing that, so far they've had an easier time going, oh yeah, that happened. Nope, this happened last time. No, I remember. And a lot of these stories are very personal so far. And I'm bringing all this up because we talk about structure and how effective that is. And I am trying a sandboxy approach, but even that sandbox approach has structure in it. The closing of the story arcs and the story elements, the mini loops, are a day or several days, but we always end as night falls. And people, go back to their, whatever their headquarters are, their home base. And then they give me their homework and I structure the session so they have opportunities to fulfill whatever those goals are. That's structure. It isn't okay, well, guys, you wake up and let's see what you think of to do. It's, you get a knock on your door. It's this person. They're here for the inspection. The inspection that we've been alluding to for a few sessions that you've told me you're kind of stressed about. Here's the inspection. Let's move through it. And that's an opportunity to enact on those things that we've brought up. But if you're a person that's like, you know what, I'm not comfortable doing in these segmented scenes, you can still do a sandboxy, I say this, put this in quotations, a sandbox approach. A sandbox approach doesn't mean, though, that you walk in and nobody has a plan and you just go. You can still have a semblance of structure. Structure is not a negative. So I'm enjoying having that, and it's created some of the most organic and valuable experiences so far in a campaign. We've only had 2 sessions.
Okay, I know I just said I'm done with this, but I have one last little thing, which is just, in all honesty, most of the sandbox games I've played end up being which set of scenes would you like to go down. So even if you consider, say, like Skyrim was an example Ian brought up as like an open world game, you get to choose where you're going to go. You don't have to follow the main quest. Well, when you get into a dungeon, it's still, there's a set of scenes you run through, you know? So the only warning I have for sandbox players is sandbox actually requires more prep, not less, because you have to prep for several different possibilities. And if you don't prep for any of them, then you really risk your game losing immersive, meaningful elements, right? So either you're a sandbox and you don't prep, in which case you lose meaningful and immersive elements, which I started with are not necessary to having fun with a game, but certainly there are a lot of players, that's how they find fulfillment in their game. So it might not be as fun to them if you don't have anything, or, you know, the prep might honestly just be kind of inefficient, where like, say you're prepping for 5 different stories, but your players only pick one of them. So, and that's why I really think that having a player-driven episodic approach, I found for me, again, no judgment on how you want to spend your time or anything, has definitely been the most efficient and the most fulfilling way to prep, because I ask my players what they want to do ahead of time, and then I let them, you know, dictate what kind of story I'm going to tell them, but then I prep for that story, you know? So, and that's the thing, is that they are making the sandbox choice just before I've prepped the rest of the sandbox, you know? So, and I think that that's, to me, is the middle ground, but I know that there are other DMs where that approach either might be uncomfortable, or it just might not be something that they're interested in. Maybe they really want to practice building out a very complex, in-depth world. More power to them. I just don't have that kind of time on me.
It helps a lot that IO is an established setting, and I already have so much dedicated into it, but that's what the homework model is. Hey, this is what happened. What do you want to make sure? What do you want to make sure you accomplish next time? And what are you still working toward? And then that provides, in the grander scheme of what scenes might be happening, like what are the greater forces at work, that allows me to prep opportunities for each of those things, which provides personal connection. And I would rather do that than just go, all right, and go, because that stresses me out. That's a lot of pantsing.
I think the core of Dungeons & Dragons is puzzle and encounter design. I'll draw from favorite movies, video games, books, anything to create a one-of-a-kind play experience. When you start with a solid framework, all you need is to grab your best friends and hilarity ensues naturally. I'm Sully, Dungeon Master and host of the podcast How Friends Roll, a 5th edition actual play podcast of micro-campaigns featuring a rotating cast of characters. Come join our table. How Friends Roll is available wherever you get your podcasts.
So recently we got a question from one of our listeners that you guys can also contribute to if you go to the Darkmoor Podcast Network Discord. And it was regarding the topic of play-by-post. It's a type of game played on public forums. Sometimes it's played on Discord even. I've actually heard a lot of people do that. And in some cases, even on like Facebook Messenger or something. And the question was, what sort of experiences we have with play-by-post, and if so, if there's any advice that we have regarding the equity of voice, immersion, crafting better RP moments and such, and if we don't have experience, what sort of obstacles would we foresee running into as a player or DM of a play-by-post game, and what tips would we have to overcome those? I am using the D&D Beyond website, which has very specific rules, I think, sort of, regarding their play-by-post. There's like a whole FAQ and everything. And I just wanted to define this really quick before John takes over here, which is that a play-by-post is a campaign that takes place completely on these forums. The DM will post an initial thread, usually with the campaign description, and state what they're looking for in regards to players. Then the entire campaign takes place right in the thread. Everything your character does and says will be typed out, and you can even roll dice as a part of your reply, which is pretty cool.
So I have had some experience running a play-by-post, and it was through a Facebook group. It was through a Facebook Messenger, a whole bunch of Messenger groups branching off of that. This was when Night Owls was still trying to find its way. And I did a section, I made like a Facebook group called Night Owls Interludes, which were supposed to be small adventures or like downtime activities that the players who were playing in a game would then exchange and go inside. And like I would do a prompt of this NPC is available to talk to, and they would do that. It's not quite the same as a play-by-post. Play-by-posts have sort of a broader spectrum, but I can foresee the same problems happening that happened with this, which was, one, it became a barrier for entry, and the frequency became a barrier for entry. So I'm glad that we mentioned the equity of voice, because I had one player in particular, maybe two, that were always online and were always posting. And because they were always posting, others felt that they could not post. Or they felt that they were not as immersed, and then they slowly dropped off and then just stopped posting and removed themselves from the group without saying anything, just went, this is too much, and left. I asked them why, and they said, well, this person's posting a lot and I just don't feel like I'm connected to the story anymore. And I can see that if you have people with different frequencies online, if one person is posting a lot and another person is posting very little, the person who's posting a lot has more spotlight. However, those problems that came out of those singular players kind of ruling the stage, I think can be mitigated if there is, you can set, of course, privacy. It doesn't have to be a public thing. So we did a limited group, so only certain people that I invited could be a part of it. I started creating guidelines and like terms of use, and trying to put out that there's an expectation here that if you post, you cannot get angry if someone is not posting right away, because that's not how this works. That expectation can't be there. And then we started to think about, okay, can there be post limits if there's an interaction, and like a circumstantial post limit? So you can post once in this interaction, you have to wait for someone else to post before you can post again. And we had some players that assumed that if no one posted, all the other characters in this interaction were just silent. And then their characters got mad at the characters who were silent. Like, why aren't you saying anything? And I'm like, that's not the right expectation. This is completely asinine. You can't do that. So we had to reset all those expectations. When people didn't follow them, we kicked them out of the group. But then the group fizzled and died and fell away, because once we established those expectations and really found our own, all the people that probably would have enjoyed it in that format had left because of that first barrier. So if you do a play-by-post, you want to be upfront about what your expectations are, be very consistent in how they're enforced. And if someone's really talking a lot, it's okay to like send them a private message and be like, hang on, let other people respond first. And it's okay to establish those things. I could see this working as long as everybody is respectful of their post frequency and everyone is respectful of the amount of time and fluctuation that can change between play. It's just people are in different time zones. They have different internet connections. Some people have, jobs, and other people work from home. So their ability to respond to these things all fluctuate and all change. So you have to come into it with that understanding. And I think if everyone is respectful, there's a lot of opportunity there for depth and immersion. You can use different media sources. Heck, I remember writing a song for Night Owls at one point and distributing it to the players in interludes, and how much that increased the immersion. Like suddenly there was that surge of, oh man, this is so cool. And it bolstered activity. But then we had those players kind of take over and I had to boot them. So it takes a lot of, my final little point before I pass it off is, I think a play-by-post works really well if whoever's running it, the moderator, in this case, maybe even the DM is the moderator, has a lot of time and effort up front to devote to moderating it. It has to be, it has to be managed. And I think in some cases, depending on the setup, you might be managing even more than you would have done in a Roll20 scenario or in a real-time play with physical people at tables. And yet a play-by-post can also cross certain barriers that people would have in Roll20 and cameras and all that. So there are positives to it. I'm not trying to bash it, but you have to go in with rules kind of in mind so that you have a kind experience for everybody.
Yeah, I would say with play-by-post, it's definitely a style of game. And it's one that can reward patience and thoughtful responses. That would be the thing that would increase immersion, right? I'm also curious because I think one of the things with play-by-post, based on like what D&D Beyond said, how many players can play up to a play-by-post game? That's my other question, right? So if it's limited to like 4 players, part of the problem, because I remember Night Owl's interludes, right? And I just saw that I was invited. I saw what was happening and I got overwhelmed right away. I didn't even attempt to read it, right? Part of it was there was just so many people in it that it was like, how could this possibly be organized? So if you take out the forum part, where it's like play-by-post is part of a forum, right? Or that it's public. I've actually, looking back on it, done a lot of play-by-post games, A lot of people would argue that that Gearus, in a way, is a play-by-post game in that you wait for a player to post their comment, and then you make a thoughtful response, right? Now, I know we had talked about before recording that doesn't really count because there's a time frame where we all agree to sit down at a virtual table and kind of play out together. And it's not, there's more interactive elements with it than, say, just forum exchanges, which is almost pure theater of the mind, pure text, right? Gearus is a little bit more, there's more assets that are used and in play. But, Ian had a point in the Discord that, like, when we did our Night Owl season 3 finale, that was pretty much play-by-post. The difference, it was just Facebook Messenger, right? It wasn't a forum, right? But the idea being that it was, as the DM, Adam would type something, and then Ian and I would type our response. That was even looser because we forwent mechanics and dice rolling. It was pure narrative, which is incredibly unstable. Like, it was highly successful because the 3 of us were limited number of people with a clear understanding of what we were trying to get out of it, and also had the humility to not, like, do things that were too out of the realm of D&D, right? It's not like I'm like, well, I open a portal and 1,000,000 angels fly out. It wasn't anything over the top, right? There were some abilities that I remember using where I'm like, there's really not a spell for this. But the effect that I was going for wasn't something that was out of the realm of the spell slots I had available, So, and actually, the other play-by-post games I've been a part of, it's always been either as a one-on-one or it's been, say, a small group of people. Like, I'm getting prepped for another game here coming up that'll have 7 people online, which will be in the next podcast episode if you listen to the next podcast episode. But the idea there being, though, I have like clumps of people where I made like a clump of 4 people. It's like, your characters have this theme or this experience in common. How do you resolve that? Or how does this leverage going into the next story, Or I'll have, I did this with 2 players where I'm like, in the last session, your 2 characters, for whatever reason, seem to have some kind of connection. So we're going to foster that a little bit. We're going to invest in that dynamic by doing a short play-by-post kind of thing. And Adam is absolutely right. It's one of those things where you can't expect people to respond right away, if nothing else than internet connection, right? There's been plenty of times I've sent something, it says the person has seen it, but it might just be that their phone said that they saw it, but they really have another tab. You can't rely on the normal speed of interaction, which also means now you have the time to craft thoughtful responses. So it's a sword that cuts both ways. But I found that for me, because I'm more of a writer than an actor, play-by-post is more immersive than at the table play, and it's more energizing or more energetically efficient than at the table play, as long as everyone's respecting the rules and you're keeping a reasonable amount of players kind of in the realm of everything, and also you do aftercare too. So like, part of the process of running something like this, like especially the equity of voice, I thought was a fascinating term. You notice a player hasn't been speaking up. You check in with them. Are you not? Why aren't you speaking up? And sometimes you'll get, I don't know what to say. I feel overwhelmed. There's a lot going on. I'm waiting for my turn. Sometimes you get, my character is quiet and likes to observe things from the background. And you want to respect that. You don't want to hammer them into interacting if it's inappropriate for the concept that they're going for. And a lot of times character concepts can match with player personalities too. Like that character type, it might be that character is easily distracted, and they're going to go do laundry, and they're going to go do the dishes, and they're also going to do stuff in the background while this play-by-post sort of thing is going on. So they play a quiet, contemplative character, and they can just read the posts to catch up on what happened, but you're not fighting against their distractibility. You're working with it. So, I mean, I feel like this is a format we've been doing, like just the idea of text-based play we've been doing for a while. The very strict definition of it has to be a public forum. We have not been doing as much, but I also question if D&D Beyond's definition relates to specifically what D&D Beyond can offer, as opposed to this is what play-by-post is as a format of game.
I was just going to say, I think arguably D&D Beyond's play-by-post forum is actually a pretty prime example, if not just because most people who play D&D, at least in my experience, seem to have familiarity with D&D Beyond. They seem to use it to either keep track of their character sheets or roll or other things. Even Roll20 has a integrated D&D Beyond plugin or something like that. And so I feel like you could argue that it's pretty typical of play-by-posts. I can't really see play-by-post being any different than this, to be honest, because I mean, even on Facebook, I'm part of this Facebook group called My D&D Group or something like that, and they have a play-by-post thing going on. I don't know if it's still actively going on, but it's somewhere in the archives. And it looked pretty much like this, except I guess it's probably easier to respond and harder to roll dice. So I think that I think this is pretty accurate. And again, it's not just the fact that it's a public forum that is separating it from how Gearus works. Oh, that's pretty cool.
Well,
Sorry, my hand
Gearus,
is.
But like the Facebook Messenger thing we did is what is my point. You know?
Yeah. So with that, I would argue that we had also organized a time frame to take care of that. So yeah, we could have like continued it on to the next day or something like that, but basically it was all delegated to that time frame on a Friday evening. So where we knew we would all be online, and we wanted to get it done because we were interested in it, and also it was the finale, so it's like there's a sense of urgency almost. But where play by post, you know, depending on the expectations you set up, like Adam was talking about, you might not respond more than once a day, more than once a week even. You know, it depends on the players, it depends on what you're looking for. And I think that flexibility also allows players, at least players who enjoy writing, I should preface this with, it allows players who enjoy that sort of thing to take their time with it, like you were saying, crafting a very nice, thoughtful response. And actually part of the question from our listener here had to do with crafting better RP moments in play-by-post, which implies to me that they may have experienced RP that is not as fulfilling or not as rewarding or even inappropriate because it's the internet. So yeah, I was actually thinking of answering that part of the question directly, and by saying, as a creative writer, when I'm looking to create better social moments, I'm usually trying to integrate and weave into the description something about how the character is doing. You know, a lot of people, a lot of writers talk about show, don't tell. So you don't say they got mad. You imply they got mad by the character's expression that you write about. So they furrow their eyebrows, they narrow their eyes, their nostrils flare, that kind of thing can be really, really useful, really immersive, I feel, in this kind of a setting. At least that's how I would do it. Another thing is using the senses. So like we're primarily visual audio people, visual auditory people. And you know, just as a species, but integrating smell, taste, touch, proprioception. I'm going to say that again. Proprioception, which is the sense that indicates how balanced you are. It's how your body keeps track of where it is in space. And when it's messed up, you become unbalanced and you fall down. And so that's one for sure. Like, especially if you're dealing with like some sort of like psychic entity or something like that, you know, mind flayers and such, they might be exuding this aura that is making you physically ill because you find yourself unbalanced, things like that. Otherwise, it can be as simple as coming up with actionable goals for your characters and working on them through the RP. So that's actually something I think we talked about like 30 episodes ago or something like that at this point, which is knowing what your character's goals are and knowing how they would act in a scenario based on those goals, even if they're like short-term goals. Like, all right, I need to get to here so I can complete my bigger goal. Then this is how I would behave in the situation to fulfill that need.
So a part of the issues that came from interludes and feeling very overwhelmed is actually the players didn't buy into the patience model. So enough of them were so keen to post right away that they didn't think about what their responses were. They didn't even, maybe speaking to a few, they admit that they didn't even read half the post. So they read only half of the details and then responded quickly, like a knee-jerk reaction. Now, some of that comes from their own experiences, feeling like they need to respond now. Otherwise, their thoughts will get lost in the mix, or they won't get a chance. And yet, that's not how this whole thing works. So it has to be that the players need to agree to patience. And that's where I find the immersion breaks, because when you go too quickly without reading like what the post was, you miss all those important details. So I would have a player get off on a train of illogical thought that was already answered in the first post of, here's the description, this is what it is. They read the first half and went, oh, it's this, and they went blah, 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 and they 7 posts down. I have to, and it happens like that. So like I put the post up, I walk away because I have things to do, and I'll come back and say, okay, I wonder what someone posted. And then I've got the same player doing this thought train of 7 to 9 posts, and I stop and go, read the post. And that also breaks immersion. There are other instances where you'll have players that aren't, in a way, we say they aren't listening, they're not reading. Where they all go too fast, or they missed a key detail. And then we have to kind of go back, and sometimes I'll repost the description and really highlight the thing that make sure you see that. Oh, I didn't know it was that. What'd you change? Nothing. I didn't change anything. It's the same post. But if everyone is invested in the same structure and has all bought into patience, that's going to also increase immersion. It breaks down misunderstandings. It creates a mutual respect at this virtual table, and that's going to already aid immersion. We all have the social contract, and we're all following it. That's going to also allow each of us to invest better, and that increases immersion.
Yeah, so just to kind of wrap this one up, because I'm looking at the question again, just as kind of like a summary, because I like when there's like a nice bullet point summary, rather than having to be like, wow, that was a lot of stuff. How do I process this? So pretty much advice for the equity of voice. Again, like Adam just said, be patient, be respectful. A lot of times it's honestly the same soft skills that you see at the table. So if you notice a player hasn't spoken up a lot, reaching out to them, or if you know that a character concept is better for this moment to shine, giving them that moment to shine. So if there's like the bard was built to be the face of the party, that the player was open for that during character creation, being like, oh, hey, this is a talkie part, bard, do your thing, do bard things, it's going to help build trust at the virtual table, immersion and crafting better RP moments. Again, just be patient, take your time writing things out, and just being thoughtful. And you don't have to be a creative writer to write creatively. Like, even experiencing in a chat-based format, there's been players that have been like, I'm not really the creative writing type. And it's like, they still a lot of times have thoughtful moments. In fact, one of our patrons who's listening to this right now, it was funny because they were rereading one of the things and they're like, wow, John, this was a really thoughtful thing you just said. And I said, man, I copied and pasted your text. Like, it's not me. This is what you said. So if you think it's deep, it's good because you wrote it, So sometimes, a lot of times the knee-jerk reaction I find is out of insecurity more than anything. So this is an excellent time to learn to be patient with yourself and be a little vulnerable, in terms of obstacles, really, it comes back to patience. Like, if you're trying to build momentum, or you're not waiting for responses, or you're not thoughtfully receiving somebody else's post, then it's going to make the entire experience feel a little jolted. And really, it's going to detract from the immersive experience that everyone might be looking for. And then the other thing I would just say on that same note, what obstacles, if you have too many players, it's too many things to keep track of, just like the real table. If you wouldn't have 11 players at your real table to try to juggle, don't have 11 people in your play-by-post game, So have 2 sessions and split them up into like 5 and 6 or something, or even 3 sessions where it's 4, 4, and 3. A lot of times you want to, there's a magic balance between 3 and 5 players where you have just enough input that it makes things interesting, but you don't have so much going on that it creates some white noise.
Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in to today's episode of DM Shower Thoughts. You can follow us on iTunes and Spotify, where this podcast uploads every Friday at noon. And check out our Patreon at patreon.com/DM Shower Thoughts. Hang out with us on the Darkmoor Podcast Community Discord by heading over to darkmoorpodcasts.com and our Facebook at DM Shower Thoughts Community. Have a wonderful day, and please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.